Hello and welcome to Theology Deep Dive, and today we're looking at Molinism and whether or not it collapses into determinism. So let's dive in. Hello, my name is Patrice Petel, and today we're looking at an article from Free Thinking Ministries with Dr. Tim Stratton, where he discusses the idea that where he argues against idol killer as to whether or not Molinism collapses into determinism, and it is a friendly response to idol killer. And so my episode today is just that, a friendly response to Dr. Stratton's response to idol killer. Warren McGrew, like me, believes in dynamic omniscience. I also hold to dynamic omniscience. I was briefly a Molinist in my pilgrimage, my theological pilgrimage. I was also I held briefly to simple foreknowledge. Well, most of my younger Christian life, I held to simple foreknowledge. Then briefly became a Molinist and toyed with the idea of open theism. Well, at least since the early 2000s. So I toyed with it, but never fully committed to it. I hesitated. Whether it was Molinism, simple foreknowledge, open theism, and finally I settled down on dynamic omniscience. And during early on, I would hold to eternal now system where God was outside of time and looking down. You know, the old image of he's on top of a tower looking down at a parade, and you can see the end from the beginning of the parade. So I held to that briefly. It didn't make any sense to me that God could be outside of time, but I held to that, thinking that it was spiritual to do so. Then fell back on divine foreknowledge. Then vacillated between dynamic omniscience or open theism at that time, Molinism, foreknowledge, and I was trying to evaluate the three positions and settled down with dynamic omniscience, I guess around 2014, perhaps 2015. That's where I said, okay, I hold to dynamic omniscience. That's the one that makes the most sense to me. So, and I want to do a response to Dr. Stratton's argument here. Now, for context, I did my graduate work and my postgraduate work where I studied, so it's in philosophy of religion, and my main focus for my PhD dissertation was on Molinism and dynamic omniscience. I was evaluating the two systems which would best fit the theodicy, which theodicy would be better, one based on Molinism or one based on dynamic omniscience. I settled for the dynamic omniscience one. So I studied this rather extensively, so Molinism and dynamic omniscience, and the whole idea. One of my favorite thinkers is Arthur Pryor with his whole temporal logic system. His corpus is amazing. I've read through it. Was very very complicated read, but a fascinating read. I read also many other authors, but so I want to respond to Dr. Stratton today. So let's dive into this article here. Does Molinism collapse into determinism? A friendly response to idol killer. And so one of the great joys of engaging in philosophical and theological dialogue is doing so with friends. And I do think that Dr. Stratton is a friend. Although I never met him, I'm sure we'd have a great time, perhaps over coffee, or if he has a few beers sometimes, over a beer, discussing theology, discussing philosophy. I'd love to have this chat with him. So he is answering to this critique by Warren on Molinism, where Warren will say, Molinism claims to preserve free will by saying God uses middle knowledge, his knowledge of what non-existent free creature would choose, to actualize a world where they freely do just that. However, since these choices are ungrounded in actual beings, God is essentially imagining outcomes and ensuring they occur through creation. This makes Molinism functionally indistinct from Calvinism, where God directly decrees all events in both views. God's creative act fixes all future events. Though Molinism may avoid direct causation, its reliance on God's selection of a specific world renders all choices equally determined. Thus, Molinism collapses into a form of theistic determinism, and the supposed preservation of libertarian free will is illusory. Now, I agree wholeheartedly with Warren here. On Molinism, free will is illusory. Now, of course, this is certainly not in line with the claims of Molinism, but the claims of Molinism, I think, and I'm pretty sure this is Warren's conclusion as well, the claims are self-refuting, self-contradictory. I don't think that as a system, Molinism can uphold libertarian free will. At best, it is my opinion that it only can uphold, it can go only as far as compatibilistic free will, not libertarianly free will. So, in other words, the ability described by mononists are not categorical ability to do otherwise, but conditional ability to do otherwise. In other words, had the past been different, then the agent could do otherwise, could have done otherwise. Given the past situation, the agent cannot do otherwise. He does not have the categorical ability to do otherwise. So let's look at this, and let's first look at Dr. Stratton's definition of Molinism, of determinism. I'm sorry here. Let me just go here and just go here like this. Okay. So Dr. Stratton's definition goes as such. So determinism, as defined by Stratton and Morin, is the view that prior states of affairs unavoidably lead to specific outcomes, leaving no room for alternative possibilities. So determinism is the idea that antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate all events or effects. So this is basically Dr. Stratton's own definition of determinism, and we'll look at what this definition entails. Let's just go here. So determinism is the idea that antecedent conditions. So antecedent condition, it speaks of prior states of affairs. So physical conditions, laws of nature, initial circumstances. So everything in the past from that point, all right, from the point we are considering, the temporal location we are considering, everything that is past from there, those are the antecedent conditions. So determinism is the idea that antecedent conditions are sufficient. What does sufficient mean? Well, sufficiency means that a condition is sufficient if its presence guarantees the occurrence of a specific outcome. It's the presence of that condition guarantees the occurrence of a specific outcome. Now, in a conditional statement, if A then B, A is sufficient for B if A's occurrence ensures B's occurrence. However, sufficiency does not imply necessity. B could occur without A. So you cannot just affirm the consequent, nor can you deny the antecedent. Both are formal fallacies. But so, you cannot just say, well, B occurred, therefore A must have occurred, or you can say A did not occur, therefore B cannot occur. So there's no, it doesn't go both ways. It's not a if only if situation. All right? So let's go here. Determinism is the idea that antecedent conditions are sufficient. So the antecedents are sufficient to guarantee. Let's just go here like this. To guarantee the occurrence of a specific outcome. All right? So let's go here. So determinism is the idea that antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate. Now, necessitate, what does that mean? What does that mean, necessitate? So necessity refers to that which must be the case, either logically, metaphysically, or physically, or any other types of necessity, because there are many kinds of necessity. Necessity does not limit itself to logical necessity or metaphysical necessity. So let's go to what is necessity. Now, what is a necessity? Necessity refers to a condition in which something must be the case. A proposition B is necessary if it is not possible for P to be false, expressed formally by box P or necessarily P. Now, listen, and this is very important because many times when you speak with Molinists, and mostly Molinists, I guess, have this, they will use the possible world semantics to speak of all the many possible worlds that God could have created. And there's a potential infinity of worlds that God could have possibly created. So think of these possible worlds as different stories that God could have written about the universe. Okay, so all the different stories God could write about the universe, and these are every imaginable way things could go, every combination of choices, events, and outcomes. A possible world could have you choosing cereal for breakfast, or maybe dinosaurs never went extinct, or anything that could be logically possible is included in that. All right, so these are all the possible worlds. So imagine a universe of possibility. All right, a potentially infinite set of possible worlds. Now, among these possible worlds, there is a subset, which Molinists call feasible worlds. And feasible worlds, so let me just, so a feasible world is a smaller group of those stories that God can actually make happen while still respecting human free will. These are the worlds where people make their own choices freely, and God knows what they would choose in every situation. And this is what Molinists call middle knowledge. All right? Some possible worlds aren't feasible because the free choices people would make wouldn't line up with certain outcomes God might want. So, God has these criteria in his mind of what he wants the world to look like. He wants the world to be populated by free agents. So all the worlds that don't have free agents, he just puts out of. He doesn't consider them. All right. So he will only consider the set of possible worlds where free agents exist. Now, in possible world semantics, you have this concept of metaphysical necessity. Now, metaphysical necessity, and it is important to understand this, metaphysical necessity is included, it's not just that something is true in all possible worlds. This is an oversimplification of the idea of metaphysical necessity that oftentimes you will hear Molinists speak about. But that's not the whole picture. In possible world semantics, metaphysical necessity is a proposition is metaphysically true or necessary if it is true in a set of accessible possible worlds. So imagine this set of possible worlds where, for instance, like all the feasible worlds here that God wants to create, these are the feasible worlds. So in those worlds, free will is necessary, because in these there's an accessibility relation between those worlds, and inside of that set of feasible worlds, so free will is necessary. It's not necessary in all these other possible worlds, but that's besides the point. On possible world semantics, something is necessary if it is true in a set of accessible worlds. It is possible if only of these accessible worlds, if it is true in only some of the possible worlds, but not all. All right, so you see the difference between something which is metaphysically necessary and metaphysically possible. It is always in this set of possible worlds that share an accessibility relation one with the other. All right, so now imagine that, so to pick up on my illustration here, imagine that these worlds are different islands in a big ocean. Not every island can be reached from every other island. It depends on the bridges between them. So in Molinism, these bridges are like the rules of how things work, especially human free will and God's plan. So the accessibility relation is like a fancy way of saying, of talking about these islands, these worlds, that God can get to from his starting point based on, one, what people would freely choose, and also to his own personal, what he wants to accomplish in creating the universe. All right, so this is the accessibility relation, and it's important to understand that for something to be necessarily true, it has to be true in every possible accessible world. Not necessarily in all the possible worlds, but only in the subset of that share an accessibility relationship one with the other. All right? And this is an important distinction. So like I was saying, there are many kinds of necessity. There is the one that's perhaps most known is metaphysical necessity. I won't look into logical necessity. Well, I'll be discussing logical necessity all throughout, but I want to focus on these different kinds of necessity here. So, a metaphysical necessity is a truth that state of affairs that must hold in all possible worlds due to the fundamental nature of reality beyond mere physical or logical constraints. It is governed by an accessibility relation, so this is what I was talking to you about, which determines the set of possible worlds relevant for evaluating the necessity, typically those sharing essential properties or metaphysical principles with the actual world. For example, water is H2O. So maybe metaphysically necessary if water's essence requires a composition in every accessible world. So everywhere, in every world, in every possible world where water is H2O, then in all this galaxy of worlds, water necessarily is H2O. This is the proper way of referring to this kind of metaphysical necessity. All right? It's not just that it is true in all possible worlds, in all these potentially infinite possible worlds I was talking to you initially. That's not what is metaphysical necessity. That's not just what, of course, something that is true in all the possible worlds like God. Then if it's true in all the worlds, then it's necessarily true. But if it's true in a subset of accessible worlds, one to the other, then it is also necessarily true in those worlds. All right? Okay. Metaphysical necessity. Truth must hold in all possible worlds due to reality's fundamental nature. It is stronger than mere physical laws. It is distinct from logical truth, and it has an accessibility relation. There's a link between the worlds. So water equals H2O in all the relevant worlds where water is H2O. All right? Then, there's also historical necessity. Now, historical necessity, this is, as has often been described historically by the Scholastic as quod fuit non potest non fuisse, which means that what has been cannot now not have been. So, for instance, the past, it is the necessity of the past, for instance, because what has been can never not have been. Even God cannot make it that the past didn't exist. Why? Because before the time he made it not exist, well, it existed. So it's like necessarily true that it existed. In every possible world, the actual past actually existed. All right? So it is necessarily true. So even if an event was once contingent, it becomes historically necessary once it occurs. So Arthur Pryor explored how tense changes the modal character of propositions. For instance, before Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Caesar might not cross the Rubicon, but after he did, it is now necessarily the case that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. So you see, the necessity of the past is illustrated by this example here. Then you have the meaning and the implication of the historical necessity. So this expresses the idea that once an event has occurred, it becomes irrevocably necessary. The event was not logically necessary before it happened, but after it happened, it is necessarily part of the past. Thus it's a clear articulation of necessity ex post facto, or what Pryor called now unpreventable. It is now unpreventable because it has occurred. So now unpreventable temporal necessity. So temporal necessity. A proposition is now unpreventable if, although it may not be logically necessary, it is no longer possible to prevent it from occurring given the current moment of time, in time. It reflects a kind of temporal closure, and the window of preventability has closed, even if the proposition was once contingent. So now, even if the proposition was once contingent, so it was only true in some of the possible relevant worlds at that time, now in the actual world, there's no possible world where it is unpreventable, basically. It will occur, it must occur. There's no other possibility in the timeline for it not to occur. It is now unpreventable. So this is what Pryor called now unpreventable or temporal necessity. So now unpreventable events, a proposition is now unpreventable if it is no longer possible to prevent it. Even though it is not logically necessary, some future events become temporarily inevitable, not because they are necessary, but because the conditions to prevent them are no longer available. So let's take a gun, for instance. So once the trigger has been pulled, all things being equal, I mean, the powder is dry, the munition is all right, the gun is fully loaded, and everything functions properly. Once you pull the trigger, well, the gun will shoot, and the target will be hit, all things being equal. So it is now unpreventable. Okay. Then another type of necessity is conditional necessity. So conditional necessity, given a certain antecedent, the consequence follows necessarily. So now this is important because even though, so in a conditional statement, if A then B, for example, the antecedent is the if A. The consequent is the B. All right, if A, then B. Now, if it is a conditional necessity, then given A, B necessarily follows, even if B in itself is a contingent and not necessary. All right, what does this mean? So, one must not conflate the necessity of the consequence, so the consequence is necessary, with the necessity of the consequent. This is what we call the famous modal fallacy. All right? Yet, the conditional necessity, it is no less a necessity, and it is still incompatible with libertarian free will. So if it is a necessary event, it is not a contingency, and libertarian free will is a contingent event. All right? One must realize this is very important. So once the antecedent is fixed, the outcome is modally locked in. Locked and loaded and shot, and the target will be hit. No other possible outcome is possible. All right? Now, a conditional necessity is still a necessity. The scope of the necessity may be restricted by the antecedent. What does this mean? It means that it is not a wide necessity in all the possible accessible worlds. Yet, so the scope is restricted, all right? But once the antecedent is fixed, the modal force of the consequence is absolute because of the necessity of the consequence. All right? Now, libertarian freedom requires outcomes that are not necessary, even conditionally so. Now, let's talk about a special kind of conditional, so what we call counterfactuals, and this is relevant for Molinism, because Molinism will often talk about counterfactual of creaturely freedom, CCFs. So counterfactuals are a special kind of conditional statement. It is a subjunctive conditional where the antecedent is actually false. It is contrary to fact conditional. So the antecedent is contrary to fact. Counterfactuals involve scenarios that did not actually happen but are imagined. So let's take my gun. I don't have a gun, all right? But imagine I had one. So I live in Canada, so there's no 2A here. There's no clause 2A where I would have the freedom to acquire a gun. So, sadly. So let's say I had a gun, and if I had pulled the trigger, I would have hit the target. So if I didn't pull the trigger, I don't even have a gun, so I couldn't pull the trigger. But if I had pulled the trigger, if I had had a gun, if I had pulled the trigger, I would have hit the target. So you see, this is a counterfactual. It's actually false. I don't have a gun. I didn't pull the trigger, but the scenario is imagined. And the modal force, so of a wood conditional, so a wood subjunctive conditional, the modal force expresses a necessity. Necessarily, if I had pulled the trigger, all things being equal, the shot would have been fired and the target would have been hit. All right? So the modal force of counterfactuals, they express what would necessarily happen or what would possibly follow from an unrealized condition. So the antecedent has not been realized, but if it had been realized, then either it would have been, the consequent would have been necessarily so or possibly so. All right? So there are actually two kinds of counterfactuals in philosophy. There are would conditionals, subjunctive conditionals, and might subjunctive conditionals, or you could say would counterfactuals and might counterfactuals. So let's look at them. So a would counterfactual is a subjunctive conditional where the false antecedent, if true, would necessitate the consequent. So a subjunctive conditional where the false antecedent, if it had been true, or if it were true, would necessitate the consequent. Now, a might counterfactual is one where the antecedent, if true, establishes a relation of possibility between the antecedent and the consequent. So, in a would counterfactual, the consequent is a necessary outcome of the truth of the antecedent. So, in a might counterfactual, the consequent is a contingency, is a contingent affair. It is a mere possibility. And this is important because, not here. This is important because what I quickly realized when I started to study Molinism more accurately, more properly, particularly in my graduate level and postgraduate levels study of this, and especially for my dissertation, I realized that Molinism is a peculiar and internally strained synthesis of divergent and often idiosyncratic philosophical commitments. So what do I mean by this? Is that sometimes, or oftentimes, Molinism will have these philosophical commitments or tools that they will use, for instance, CCFs, Counterfactuals of Creaturely Freedom, and they will use them in a way that is completely idiosyncratic. What does that mean? It means that nobody else uses it like that but Molinist. So they will use this tool to support their claims, but they're used in a very weird way. Because like I just said, in philosophy, there are two kinds of counterfactuals, two kinds of conditionals, subjective conditionals. The would conditional, where the consequent is necessitated, and the might conditional, where it is merely possible. But what Molinists want to say in their Molinist counterfactual is that you have a would conditional, so where the antecedent necessitates the consequent, and yet the consequence nevertheless is a contingent affair, state of affair. So it's like saying, well, you see that guy over there? Well, he's a bachelor, but in such a way that he's married. That makes no sense. Well, he's either a bachelor or he's either married. One is a contradictory of the other. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. In French, you say, tu peux pas avoir le chou et la chèvre. You cannot have the cabbage and the goat. All right? The goat will eat the cabbage. So what they want to say that you have a would conditional, a would subjunctive conditional, where there's a necessitation, so the antecedent necessitates the consequent, and yet they maintain that the consequent is still a contingency. So they will say, what would the person freely do? And it is so stable that the relationship between the antecedent and the consequent is so stable, so strong, that this serves as a ground for God's middle knowledge. So God can see this so stable in a way that is so stable that it actually serves as a ground for God's knowledge. God can know them. So this is very strong. It's really a hybrid of the would conditional and the might conditional, because the might conditional establishes a contingency and the would conditional establishes a necessity, and yet they want to have both in a hybrid form while using the vocabulary of a would conditional, a would subjunctive conditional that establishes a necessity. So it's very, very peculiar indeed. Now, let's continue the article. I want to, I just want to read this because I feel it is very relevant to what I'm saying now. So this is a quote by C.S. Lewis, which will say, and for me this is very, very relevant. He will say, his omnipotence means power to do all that is intrinsically possible, not to do the intrinsically impossible. You may attribute miracles to him, but not nonsense. This is not to limit his power. If you choose to say God can give a creature free will and at the same time withhold free will from it, you have not succeeded in saying anything about God. Meaningless combinations of words do not suddenly acquire meaning simply because we prefix to them the two other words God can. So you can't attribute nonsense to God. And I think this is really, really important to see this. So let's continue the article. Okay, perhaps like this. Okay, I think now you see the whole article here. This is a clear and concise expression of a common concern. So we're continuing what the quote he made from Warren. This is a clear and concise expression of a common concern raised by open theists and others who fear that Molinism, despite its claims, cannot ultimately safeguard libertarian freedom. And while I appreciate the precision with which Warren presents his case, I believe the objection ultimately fails. What follows is a friendly response and clarification. And again, this episode of Theology Deep Dive really wants itself to be a friendly response to Dr. Stratton. I think it's important to have this kind of dialogue. Perhaps I completely misunderstand Molinism, so I doubt it, or else I would change my mind on it. But right now, as it stands, so you know where I'm coming from. Oh, here a second. So for me, it is not possible for God to know in advance a human free will decision or free agent's decision ahead of time, because these decisions are pure contingency. So meaning what? Meaning that either I will do A and I will do B. Either or. I might do A and I might do B. All right? So the two possibilities are there in front of me. It's an either or situation. And right now, as it stands, the contingency is true. And if the contingency is true and unresolved, therefore, I can either do A and B. Both are within my grasp. So God cannot resolve the situation without withdrawing my libertarian free will from me. He wouldn't be robbing me. He's God, he can do whatever he wills. But if he wants to keep me libertarianly free, he cannot know in advance what I will do. Now, if I'm wrong about this, then my mindset is that if it is possible for God to know this in advance, then necessarily he does so. So these are the logical moments in Molinism. So in logical moment A, you have natural knowledge, which covers all the possibilities and all the necessities in reality. So God knows everything necessary and everything possible. All the possibilia, all the necessity. B, the middle knowledge, is God knows in advance what everybody would do in given circumstances. Not what they could do, but what they will do, what they would do under given certain circumstances. So, as far as I go, I think I hold to natural knowledge. I think Warren does too. And I think that every model start with natural knowledge, and we all hold to this. And I believe that God knows everything that I could do, everything that all the the free creatures could do, all the possibilities, but not necessarily what they would do under any particular circumstance. And so there's middle knowledge, then there's the decree. God says, I will be doing this. Then there's free knowledge, which depends on the decree. And then there's creation, where he pulls the trigger, so to speak. And then there's a thin red line, which is the actual timeline, the actual historical timeline. This is what is happening from creation till now. And the dotted lines, are all the after the decree. Well, God could have chosen all these other possibilities among the feasible worlds. So these represent the feasible timelines. All right. Now, so where I stand is that if God knows that what I will do, not I would do, what I will do, if God knows in advance what I will do, then necessarily he knows this. There's no middle knowledge. He knows reality. So I do believe God knows reality as it is. If he knows that I will do something, then necessarily he does so. He knows this. All right. If it is not possible for him to know this, then it's not possible for him to know this. There's no middle knowledge, and I don't really hold to any form of decretal theology, meaning anything decreed before the creation of the world, where God has an all-encompassing decree. I don't hold to this. For me, God makes many decrees. He will say, well, as time rolls by, he said, well, I decide to do this, I decide to do that. He may change his mind, may not change his mind, depending on the situation. That's up to him. He's sovereign. All right. So this is the way I see things. Now, this paints God's middle knowledge as speculative or fictional, but that misrepresents the heart of Molinism. God doesn't merely imagine what creatures would do. He knows what they would freely do in any possible circumstances. Now, this is important because this is at the heart of Molinism. God knows what they would freely do. This is in the middle knowledge point where I showed you earlier. These counterfactuals are grounded not in the inactualized creatures, but in the essences of possible creatures within the omnipotent God's power to create. And now this is another idiosyncratic idea in Molinism. Why do I say this? Because typically in philosophy, essences are abstract objects that capture the necessary and sufficient properties defining what a thing is. For example, the essence of a human might include rationality and animality. Essences are universal and abstract and abstract. Now, essences are universals, usually. Normally, the essence of a man is, like I said, rationality and animality. So this is the essence of a human being, for instance. But these are universal, not particulars. Now, what Molinists want to do is speak of individual essences. So the essence of an individual. So usually, this speaks of the excitee of the individual, the this, what this is, the this in itself, excitee. So usually this is what an individual essence is, but you must understand that the essence of somebody, so the individual of the essence of an individual is necessary for that individual. Meaning what? Meaning that given all the possible world where I exist, for me to be me, so for me to be identical to myself, so the property of identities. So for me to be identical to myself, I must share the same essence. I may have accidental properties that are different. So perhaps in one world I miss a finger because I cut it with a hatchet, whereas in the other one I did not. But this is not the essence of me. It is an accidental property of me. So perhaps in one world I like dyeing my hair black, and here I had blonde hair, now it's white. Perhaps at my age in another world I would like to dye my hair red. Accidental properties. So these individual essences or excities, the thisness, what makes the individual unique. So the distinctiveness between myself and Dr. Stratton, for instance. So this is shared by me in all the possible world where I exist. In other words, if you remember what I mentioned at the beginning, it is necessary. It is a necessity for me to have that essence. Now, if God's knowledge or middle knowledge is grounded in the essences of individuals, so individual essences, then all these choices that ground God's middle knowledge, all the what I would do given circumstance in C, it is necessary, not contingent. It is my essence which I share with myself in all possible worlds. Now, some Molinists will say, well, it is a supervenient property. So supervenience, well, for example, water. The supervenient property of water is wetness. Now, when is water not wet? It's always wet. So it doesn't solve the problem of the necessity of the essence for a being, for a particular. And if you want to compare an individual among the possible world, it makes no sense to change the essence. It's no longer me. So it doesn't solve the problem. It's still not freedom. It's something inborn in the very essence of the individual, that he will act, that I will do such and such under circumstances such and such. No freedom there. Now, so let's continue reading the article, and this will become clearer a little bit later. So let's go here. Let's continue reading the article. So these counterfactuals are grounded in actualized creatures, but not in actualized creatures, but in the essences of possible creatures within the omnipotent power, God's power to create. Now listen, and this is important because these creatures, these essences, may never be created. So these truths are timeless truth. And not only that, these truths exist outside of any actual timeline. So they are true in all possible worlds. All possible worlds. They are necessarily true, which means that they are true at the time of natural knowledge, not middle knowledge. This is problematic because you have a collapse from middle knowledge to natural knowledge. But this is a story for another time. So you have a kind of modal collapse from middle to natural knowledge. But again, I don't want to argue for this here. This is for another time. Okay. God knows what a creature would freely do because he perfectly understands their essence and how they would respond to any set of circumstances. So the nature drives the decision. This cannot be libertarianly free. This can be compatibilistically free. This is compatibilism, not libertarian free will. So, Warren claims that Molinism is functionally indistinct from Calvinism because God's creative act fixes all future events. But this depends on what it is meant by fixes. If fixes means God determines all future events in the sense that his decree is the sufficient cause of every thought, desire, and action, then this is indeed the Calvinist picture. But it is not the Molinist picture. Let me just go like this here. Okay. But it is not the Molinist picture. On Molinism, God sovereignly chooses to actualize a world in which he knows what free creature would do, but he does not causally determine them to do so. Their actions remain indeterministic and free in the libertarian sense. Now, this is what is being disputed. So this is a disputed claim here. So in other words, if on the other hand, fixed means God ensures or guarantees that certain events will happen, then yes, Molinism affirms, but guarantee is not the same as, what does he say here? As determine. So before we go any further, let me just go back to Dr. Stratton's definition of determinism. Remember the definition of determinism? He will say, determinism as defined by Dr. Stratton and Moreland. So determinism is the idea that antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate all events. And remember what we said about sufficiency? There. A condition is sufficient if its present guarantees the occurrence of a specific outcome. So hold this definition in your mind right now, and it is important because we want to understand what's being said. He continues saying, as I often say, God can guarantee and ensure an outcome without determining it. So remember, on his determinism definition, it says that it is sufficient to necessitate an outcome. This is the essence of determinism on Dr. Stratton's definition. So here, and this is interesting here, let's continue. Thus, choosing a world renders all choices determined. So Warren argues that God's choice of a specific world means that all choices are equally determined. But again, this equivocates on the term determined. An event or a choice in this case is considered determined if prior conditions are sufficient to necessitate it. On Calvinism, God's condition, God's decree provides those sufficient conditions for every event. There is no room for creaturely indeterminism. But on Molinism, God's knowledge of what creature would freely do in a freedom permitting circumstance is logically prior to his creative decree. So in another episode, I want to look at this thing about logical priority here, but right now I don't want to look at it. But it is another aspect which is problematic in Molinism, this idea of logical priority. But that's a story for another time. So God does not causally determine the creature to act. He simply knows what the creature would do freely, and he chooses to create a world in which they freely do it. Because nothing indeterministically prevents the creature from choosing otherwise, the creature could have done otherwise, even though God knew that they wouldn't. The action remains free in the libertarian sense. Molinism allows for true alternative possibilities and agent causal freedom. The agent is not determined by external or internal necessity. I'm sorry? Internal necessity? What about those essences that ground everything I will decide, how I will act? That's internal necessity here. This is exactly it. This is exactly what it is. Internal necessity. This is compatibilistic freedom, not libertarian free will. So, perhaps the heart of the confusion lies in the conflation between predestination and determinism. The two are not synonymous. To predestine is to ensure or ordain something will happen. To determine, in the relevant philosophical sense, is to necessitate via antecedent condition. But and I'm sure this is what Warren had in mind, and he can correct me if I'm wrong. But the point here is that whether it is necessitated through a causal chain, i.e. causal determinism, or whether it is necessitated via other means, it is still necessitated. And if it is necessitated, it cannot be contingent. And if it is not a contingency, then it is not a free will, libertarianly free will. So, and this is really, really important. And Warren concludes that on Molinism, libertarian freedom is illusory, but illusions are appearances that contradict reality. On Molinism, nothing contradicts reality. Agents really could have done otherwise in the actual world. Well, no, they could not, and I'll look at it right after this. But so, notwithstanding the fact that CCFs are idiosyncratic ways of understanding counterfactuals in reality. So Molinists have this very idiosyncratic way of understanding counterfactuals, notwithstanding the fact that essences are necessary for the individual's existence. I mean, are true in every possible world where that individual exists, so it is a necessity. It is true by necessity. And if God's knowledge is grounded in his knowledge of the essences that are eternally existent, because so if I was never created, for instance, well, what I would do under any circumstances would still be true. So the idea of my essence, the truth of my essence would still be eternally true in every possible world. Even if God had not created anything at all, the truth of my essence would still be true with everything it contains, all the possibility, all the counterfactuals I would do, all in this essence that God knows. This is an eternal truth. True in every point in time and in every possible world. It is a necessary truth. Why I say this? Because the truth that Pat would drink a coffee at 1801 on the 9th of May in the actual world is true if it's fully referenced in all possible worlds, and even if I had not been created, it would still have been true in the possibilia, in the set of all possible worlds that God could have created, that I would have drunk coffee at this time in this world. This is a necessity. Because it exists outside of creation. It exists as a possibility and as a counterfactual. The idea of my essence is true regardless. So this is really, so for me, Molinism is a very metaphysically loaded system. It is very heavy metaphysically. It is a loaded system, very bulky system. I don't think it's elegant, because when you dive into it very deeply, it's very bulky. It's like brings in all these ideas from different aspects of philosophy, tries to merge them together in a sort of set of philosophical claims that sometimes do not really fit one with the other. But what they want to do, and it's clear, it's a legitimate target, I think, want to preserve libertarianly freedom. They want to preserve libertarian free will and God's sovereignty. I think that the problem is they have swallowed hook, line, and sinker the definition, the Reformed definition, the Augustinian definition of sovereignty, and not the biblical definition. I don't think that Molinism or EDD is compatible with Scripture. Not because of the deterministic part, but because of the exhaustive part. The providentialism. That God providentially must providentially govern every minute details. And this must fit into his one whole plan. For me, this makes no sense. And it doesn't fit my reading of Scripture. So, and it's rather easy to read Scripture and see why God does not have this meticulous sovereignty ordaining every minute event. It's not what you read in the Bible, in the text of Scripture. It's simply not. So the Bible is incompatible with Molinism, even if in the Bible you've got some would conditionals, subjunctive conditionals, but unlike Molinism, the would subjunctive conditionals in Scripture, they are grounded in the actual world and in God's actual knowledge of the individuals. For instance, the famous place where David asks God if the folks in Keilah will deliver him to Saul. And he asked this to God with the ephod. He asked this question to God, and God says, yes, they will deliver you. And then what will happen? Well, he flees, so he's not being delivered, and Saul doesn't take him. And Saul doesn't invade the city. So, and many times folks will turn to these examples in Scripture to say, well, you see, middle knowledge exists. Well, that's not middle knowledge. Middle knowledge is it's a much more extensive claim than that. It's all this heavy scholastic baggage of logical possible worlds, logical moments in God, where God knows. It's a very, very loaded system that the Bible knows nothing about. It's not even compatible with it, because outside of creation, of creating anything, these essences live eternally true, or they don't live, but they exist in God's mind as eternal truths. This is not in Scripture. Scripture, you see Saul's army already moving. So he's heard that David was in Keilah, and so his army is moving, and so God has it's in real time. This is happening in real time. It's not something you've seen from before creation. This is happening in real time. He knows exactly the intention of Saul, the intention of everybody, everyone concerned. He knows he knows the fears and the details of everyone in Kayla. He knows them in real time. He knows all this in real time. He knows what will happen in real time. This is not middle knowledge. This is active real-time knowledge. Same thing for Jesus, where he says, if these miracles had happened in such and such a time, a city, they would have repented. Well, he knew these folks. He knew their fears. God knew their fears, their intentions, their heart. He could read all this. He knew them personally, these folks. He lived with them through it all. Like the psalmist will say, like Paul will say, he's never far from any of us. So this is real-time knowledge. This is real historical knowledge he had, which with real knowledge about who these folks, how these folks could react or would react. This is real-time knowledge, not just like knowledge of these etheric being essences somewhere in God's mind that have all these. It's as if all the counterfactuals are included in the essences. This is like very bloated ontology in my mind. So anyway, I'm extending myself right now, but so this kind of objection is often rooted in a misunderstanding known as the modal fallacy. Some assume that if God infallibly knows how someone will freely choose, that person must lack the ability to choose otherwise. But this confuses certainty with necessity. Actually, it does not do that at all. So oftentimes, and I think you will actually use this. Yeah. So you will say, God's foreknowledge of free choices is based on his mental knowledge, what creature would do freely, not a causal decree that necessitated their choice. So he will also say, I don't know if he says this here, but somewhere he says that foreknowledge doesn't cause the action, and therefore it's not determinism. And it's true, it's not determinism. But nevertheless, I do believe that foreknowledge or simple foreknowledge is incompatible with libertarian free will. Why? Because there are a few arguments that demonstrate this without falling into the modal fallacy. They are syllogism that establish that foreknowledge is incompatible with free will. Very elegant syllogism that are logically valid, that the conclusion follows from the premises. And let's look at one right now. So this is a very simple argument for necessity. Very, very simple, straightforward argument. I believe it was, what's his name? The philosopher, the great guy, he writes on the Trinity. Also, he's an open theist. William Hasker. These two arguments, I believe, were developed by William Hasker. I think the first one he quotes in one of his books, and the second one is probably his, I think. So, a simple argument for necessity. A1, so premise 1, necessarily God has always believed Clarence will have a cheese omelet tomorrow. A2, necessarily if God has always believed something will happen, it will happen. A3, therefore necessarily Clarence will have a cheese omelet tomorrow. So the argument is valid. A3 follows from A1 and 2, and it establishes that foreknowledge basically entails a necessity, very simply. So then, this is another one he has. He says, so B1, it is now true that Clarence will have a cheese omelet tomorrow. It is impossible for God to believe what is false or fail to believe what is true. God has always believed Clarence will have the omelet. No one can change God's past beliefs. Clarence cannot change God's past belief. God's belief entails Clarence's action, and Clarence cannot refrain from eating the omelet, so he is not free it's not a free choice. So very basically, this is straightforward syllogism. So again, if this fails, this syllogism fails for one reason or other that I cannot see right now, I would think that if God can possibly know future free choices of humans, then necessarily does so, and he does not have middle knowledge. So I would fall back on simple foreknowledge in my mind, and because of the many conceptual faults or failures of the Molinistic system in my mind. So let's go back here. So now I want to look at a couple of syllogisms I developed myself about to evaluate Dr. Stratton's idea about necessity and determinism. So let's go here. When I sat down to try and develop this syllogism, I wanted to try to find a name for the basic idea I was aiming at. So at first I wanted to speak of Necessitarianism, but it exists, and it is a very loaded word and a very loaded it's a very the necessity in this that is entailed by Necessitarianism is a very strong kind of necessity without any possibility of conditional necessity, and I thought that this was inappropriate for the argument I wanted to develop. Next, I thought of fatalism. And fatalism, well, it has a very strong rhetorical pull and emotional pull, and there's a equivocation also in a fatalistic outlook, and it's a bit like certainty, because certainty can sometimes mean something that is unpreventable, and certainty can sometimes mean something that you're certain of. And so there's this equivocation in certainty, and there's this same kind of equivocation in fatalism. And so I want to stay away from that. Then I thought of maybe fatalistic system, which I think was interesting, was appropriate, but still there was this rhetorical and emotional force to it that I wanted to stay clear from. So I fell back on the idea of a necessitarian system, not necessitarianism, but a system, a necessitarian system. And this is the definitions and argument I developed. So a necessitarian system is one in which all events are unalterably fixed and will occur inevitably, such that no human choice or action can alter their outcome, regardless of the mechanism fixing them. Formally, a system is necessitarian if given a set of antecedently fixed condition, events or truth, whether causal, theological, logical, or otherwise, only one outcome is possible, such that all events are inevitable and unalterable. It denies the real possibility of alternative outcomes, not solely due to causal chains or logical entailments, but because the outcome is determined by the system's fixed conditions or truth, which may include non-causal mechanism. So it's not a deterministic mechanism per se. All right. Now, so let's go back to Dr. Stratton's definition of determinism. Determinism is the idea that antecedent conditions are sufficient to necessitate all events or effects. Now, given the two definitions, every deterministic system is a necessitarian system, even if not every necessitarian system is deterministic. So properly, how I view this is that deterministic systems are subsets of necessitarian systems. All right, or the deterministic view is a subset of a necessitarian view. All right, so this is what I'm saying here. So there's logical fatalism, deterministic. There might be many different necessitarian systems in this set. All right, many different subsets. And essentially, necessitarian system is basically equivalent to the idea of fatalistic system, without perhaps the rhetorical force or emotional pull that the word fatalistic may produce in people reading it, or seeing it, or hearing it. So here's the syllogism. Okay, this I did. Okay, there. So Molinism is a necessitarian view. Any view in which all events are inevitable and unalterable regardless of the mechanism is a necessitarian view. In Molinism, God's middle knowledge and creative decree render all events inevitable and unalterable. Stratton defines determinism as the view that antecedent conditions are sufficient to render all events inevitable and unalterable. All necessitarian views are incompatible with libertarian free will, where libertarian free will is the ability of agents to choose otherwise in a given situation such that their choices are not inevitable and unalterable. Therefore, Molinism entails a necessitarian view, aligns with Stratton's own definition of determinism, and is incompatible with libertarian free will. So, as I stand, I think that the syllogism is valid. I think it is sound. I'm sure Dr. Stratton and other Molinists will dispute some of the premises. I think that perhaps the more they will dispute the fact that it is a necessarian system, but I fail to see why. Because of what Dr. Stratton basically said here, because of their belief in predestination and in total predestination, it is a necessitarian system. It is and there is this necessity involved in this. All right. So when he says here, let me just pull that up for you guys. When he says here that if on the other hand, fixes mean God ensures and guarantees that certain events will happen, then yes, Molinism affirms that. But guarantee is not the same as determine. I agree, guarantee is not the same as determine, but it is the same as necessitate. Both are necessitation. Both system, determinism, and predestination, they both necessitate the outcome. So if we go back here, if we go back to this here, so that thin red line here, the actual timeline, all right, so that thin red line here, the actual timeline, it is set in stone. There's no, once the trigger is pulled to creation, that bullet will fly through and there's no deviation from it. So perhaps it would have been free had had God let it go. So in a particular circumstance, I would have freely drunk a cup of coffee. Had it been left to myself and that particular world had actualized. But once everything is set in motion, the antecedent condition, well, guess what? The antecedent condition include B, C, and D, and E. This is included in the set of antecedent conditions. This is not outside of the antecedent condition. This is included in it. And this is why I feel that Dr. Stratton's own definition militates against his view that Molinism isn't deterministic. Well, just basically because of his definition. But I'll grant it to him, but I will say that nevertheless, it is a necessitarian system. It is a system that necessitates, after creation, everything is necessary. There's no other possible world possible. There is no alternative. So let's go back to the definition of necessity. So necessity refers to that which must be the case, either logically, metaphysically, or physically, or any other way. such that it cannot be otherwise. So again, let's go here. Necessity refers to a condition in which something must be the case. A proposition B is necessary if it is not possible for P to be false. It is necessity. It is necessary, which is another aspect of why I think that Molinism is very idiosyncratic in his understanding of necessity. So usually when I speak with, or when I chat with Molinists online, always they will give me a definition for metaphysical necessity as a proposition P is necessary if it is true in all possible worlds. So disregarding the idea of accessibility relations, disregarding the idea of conditional necessity, disregarding all this. So again, I fail to see how or why Molinism should not be considered as a necessitarian system incompatible with free will. So listen, on this I will say bye, and if you take the time, please give a like, subscribe to the channel, share it if you liked what you heard, and leave comments. I'm really looking forward to you Molinists out there writing comments, and I'd love to engage any response that Dr. Stratton or anybody else would like to make on this, any video or article. I'll gladly engage with them. So God bless you all, and have a blessed day.